This morning, going through the minor prophets, we have gotten into the book of Nahum. The book of Nahum, one of the three minor prophets that deals with a Gentile nation, Jonah, Obadiah, and Nahum. You have Jonah, who prophesied to Nineveh, the Assyrians. You have Obadiah, who prophesied to the Edomites, if you would, the cousins of the Israelites. And then once again, Nahum prophesying to second, third, fourth generation of Nineveh, 150 to 200 years after Jonah. Getting back into the book of Nahum, the book of Nahum can be broken down into four different sections. Two of those sections are found in chapter 1. You have section number 1, section number 2. Chapter 2 is section number 3. And then chapter 3 is section number 4. And then what's very fascinating about the book of Nahum is very similar to Obadiah. It doesn't really seem like there's a lot of hope. Every time we've gone over the minor prophets, we've pretty much seen that in every message of doom and judgment, there's always a message of hope. And that is the case in the book of Obadiah. But it wasn't a hope given to the Edomites. Really, it was given to the people of Judah, God's people. And talking about how in the book of Obadiah that God's people would take back the land of the Edomites, and they would reign on that hill, that mountain where they reigned at one time. That is the Edomites. And they shall reign on Mount Zion. Well, of course, when you read about Mount Zion, that's figurative language talking about the highest point in Jerusalem, really referring to where God reigns. You read a lot about Mount Zion and God's reign there in the book of Psalms through the poetry literature. And same thing mentioned in Obadiah is doomed to Edom. There's no hope for you because your time has run out. God has been long-suffering with you, but His patience has run out. But there's hope for Judah. Judah, you will receive their land. You shall prosper. Your enemies shall be destroyed. Same message in the book of Nahum. It's not the exact same account where it just has Edom swapped out for Nineveh. There's a lot more that goes into the book of Nineveh, but in a general sense, Nahum is very similar to Obadiah in the sense that there is doom to Nineveh, but there's hope for Judah and Israel. And in these sections, you have chapter 1 here, chapter 1, but specifically verse 15, the very end of the chapter. Then you've got chapter 2 and chapter 3, the close of the book. The way the book starts out in verse 1, the inspired writer of God, Nahum, actually gives us specifically who this oracle is meant for. The oracle of Nineveh. Oracle here in Hebrew, literally a burden. That's what this Hebrew word means, a burden upon Nineveh. The book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. Okay. Not much is mentioned about Nahum within the book of Nahum. If you do some background, he reigned around 658 to 615 BC. Some people will kind of reel that number back in. But he prophesies about the fall of Nineveh, which I believe, if you look at your timeline handout, Assyria fell around 612 to 600 BC. So this is right before Nineveh was about to be destroyed, quite a few years before Nineveh was destroyed. And he introduces the book by saying, this is a burden upon Nineveh. A burden. You're going to have to bear this burden. You're going to have to bear the consequences of your actions. And I am Nahum the Elkoshite, a prophet of God. And this is the oracle. In chapter 1, before he actually gets to the destruction language and what Nineveh has done and what kind of people they are, he actually introduces the oracle or the prophecy about the destruction of Nineveh by describing God. And in describing God, he describes a God of anger. He describes a God of vengeance, but he also describes a God of mercy and love and kindness. He almost bounces back and forth in this description. Now, because Nahum is just 3 chapters, we're going to be able to really look through this entire book. Maybe not every verse, but we are going to be able to look through this book. Now, starting in verse 2, it says, "A jealous and avenging God is the Lord." Now, put a pin in this real quick. As we're reading through this, if you have a paper and a pen or anything that you can write something down on, I want you to write the descriptions of God and see just how many descriptions Nahum uses to depict and paint this picture of Jehovah. Okay? So, verse 2, "A jealous and avenging God is the Lord. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries, and he reserves wrath for his enemies." So verse 2, you could say he's avenging and wrathful. Verse 3, "The Lord is slow to anger, great in power, and the Lord will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. In whirlwind and storm is his way, and clouds are the dust beneath his feet." What does verse 3 say about God? Slow to anger. It's kind of interesting how in verse 2, he's wrathful, he's vengeful, but he's also slow to anger. When we describe somebody that is our fellow man, somebody who's vengeful and wrathful, we really don't follow that up with, "But he's also slow to anger, don't worry." You know, that almost sounds contradicting. But because God is perfect in every way, he can be vengeful and wrathful in the perfect sense, but also at the same time be slow to anger. With the context of Nineveh, if you recall our description of Nineveh and the kind of people they were from our study from Jonah, how does this apply to the Ninevites?
God was patient with them, and he also respected they had souls.
That's exactly right. Sister Peggy said that God was patient with the people of Nineveh because he loved them, and he was long-suffering with them because they had souls. But at the same time, it says that his patience has run out. Look at verse 3. The world, he can't leave the guilty unpunished, for he can be long-suffering for so long. If you look at Nineveh's conversion in the book of Jonah, it says from the lowest all the way up to the king repented. But here, we'll actually see in chapter 3, I believe, verse 1, it says, "Woe to the bloody city, completely full of lies and pillage. Her prey never departs." How is Nineveh described in chapter 3 and verse 1?
They're predators.
Yeah, they are in fact predators. They hunt. They shed innocent blood. They pillage. And it never stops. Well, how did they go from all the entire city repenting, even the king, and saying, even if we don't survive this, we're going to repent because we are in the wrong, to now they are a city of blood, they pillage, they destroy, and they're full of lies? What do you think happened in that 150 to 200 years?
Time forgives.
That's exactly right. Over time, people forget God. And sadly, you see this as a cycle within God's own people, the Israelites. In the book of Judges, you see at the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua declares this great speech of, "As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord." If you want to serve the fathers, serve the gods of the Amorites or the gods of your fathers, you go ahead. I'm not going to go that route. I'm going to follow the one true God, Jehovah, and my whole household is going to serve God. Well, the people said, well, we're going to serve Jehovah too. There's only one God. That was peak Israel. They were faithful. They were steadfast in their faith. But if you read in the book of Judges, immediately after the book of Joshua, After Joshua dies and that second generation dies, it says, in that third generation arose a generation who knew not God. They didn't even know who He was. Well, after about 3 generations, 150 to 200 years, I'm almost positive Nineveh forgot who God was. God was long-suffering with them for a while. They repented, they began to follow God, but generation after generation, they fell from God, and God said, fine. I warned you with Jonah, and you repented, and I relented my wrath, I relented my vengeful nature, but you have turned back to your old ways, and I can't let this go unpunished. I'm not punishing you for your father's sins, I'm punishing you for your own sins. Those sins were forgiven, and they'll answer for their actions. I'm judging current Nineveh. Well, if you keep reading in verse 4, it says, He rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers. Bashan and Carmel wither. The blossoms of Lebanon wither. Mountains quake because of Him, and the hills dissolve. Indeed, the earth is upheaved by His presence, the world and all the inhabitants in it. Who can stand before His indignation? Now, if you recall back in the book of Jonah, when you read the book of Nahum, we should have really been doing Nahum with Jonah at the same time, because you can see parallels between the two books. How does Jonah describe Jehovah while he's talking to the sailors out on the Mediterranean Sea? Do what?
I may be wrong, but all forgiving.
Well, He is all forgiving, and we do see that in the scene of Jonah being thrown overboard and the sea calms down and those individuals are saved. But Jonah specifically describes God after he says, I am a Hebrew, I'm a prophet of God, the God of what? The God of blank and of blank. Okay, well, He is that's seen in chapter 4, full of mercy and loving kindness. Do what? It doesn't say Abraham and Jacob. That's a good guess, though. Do what? Not the God of vengeance. Not the God of wrath. He describes Him as the God of the sea and the God of dry land. He describes Him as a God of creation. I mean, God is described in all of those ways too in the book of Jonah, but Jonah describes Him very specifically as the God of creation of all things, both dry land and of the sea. What does Nahum describe God as in verses 4 through 6? Yes, the exact same way. Remember how Jonah, he says, was described Jehovah as the God of the sea and the God of the dry land, the God of everywhere, if you will. That same God who controls all those things is going to dry up the water. He's going to dry up your water supply because He is the God of the sea, the God of water. He's also going to wither up everything that is on the land because He is also the God of the land. Look at verse 7, or starting in verse 6 through 7. Who can endure the burning of His anger? His wrath is poured out like fire, and the rocks are broken up by Him. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and He knows those who take refuge in Him. But with an overflowing flood, He will make a complete end of its sight, and will pursue His enemies into darkness. Now, have you noticed in verses 1 through 8, Nineveh, well, besides the very beginning, verse 1, as an oracle of Nineveh, talking about the entire letter, the entire book, if you will. But verses 2 through 8 do not mention Nineveh at all. In fact, I don't think it's mentioned Nineveh starting in verses 9 through the end of the chapter. It just describes who God is. Why do you think that's the case?
He's no respecter of persons.
That's exactly right. What did you say?
What Nineveh was against.
Okay. He's describing Nineveh. He is describing Nineveh in the sense of they are a wicked nation. But he uses a generic term in describing Nineveh. He's saying that God is against these types of nations. So in section 1 of chapter 1, he just describes wicked nations. He's not a respecter of persons. In fact, he would not only describe Nineveh in this book, he would describe the Babylons, and I believe he mentions the Egyptians at the very end of the book. I may be mistaken, but he does mention different nations. And I think the Egyptians are mentioned in the book of Habakkuk. I'm getting those two mixed up. But in the book of Nahum, he mentions the Babylonians and he mentions the Ninevites. And he says, any nation that's this wicked, I'm going to judge. It's not just Nineveh, but Nineveh, you are an example of what I will destroy. And my patience with you, Nineveh, is up to here. I can't let this go on any longer. You need to be punished and you need to face the consequences of your actions. Now, after describing who God is, which, first of all, don't you think that it's fascinating how before he actually gets into the oracle and the destruction of Nineveh, he describes who God is? Why do you think he introduces God first? That is exactly right. Remember we talked about how over time generations will forget who God is? Remember when Jonah described God as the God of the dry land and the God of the sea? He is a God that is vengeful, and within 40 days he will destroy Nineveh. But he is also a God of mercy, God of loving kindness, God who is gracious and compassionate. Jonah chapter 4. Nineveh forgot who God was. And so Nahum's like, hey, remember that God that you forgot? Let me describe him real quick. Also, this God that I just described, he's going to judge you. So after describing who God is and that he doesn't tolerate wickedness with any nation, section 1, he then gets into the actual judgment. Look at verse 9. Whatever you devise against the Lord, he will make a complete end of it. Distress will not rise up twice. This is Nahum saying, you can't trick God. If you try to devise wickedness against God, he's going to stop it. He's going to nip it in the bud. A lot of people will say, in fact, in the book of Psalms, we read about how David would say that the wicked man says, I have gotten away with it. I have risen to power. I have cut down all of my enemies who are really just the righteous individuals of God, and God has not seen me. And David says, well, when he says that, that's when God brings him down. Because a fool says in his heart, there is no God. And when somebody says that there is no God, that I am God, in fact, I am my own God, that's when God says, all right, I've had it up to here. I've given you chance after chance. And anything that you've devised against me, I'm knocking it down. And you're going down with it, God says. Look at verse 10. Like tangled thorns and like those who are drunken with their drink, they are consumed as stubble completely withered. From you has gone forth one who plotted evil against the Lord, a wicked counselor. Verse 12. Thus says the Lord, though they are at full strength and likewise many, even so they will be cut off and pass away. Now he's really starting to talk about Nineveh, but again, he doesn't say their name. He's using generically they. It doesn't matter if a nation has tons of individuals. If they have the biggest army and the strongest military, he says, I will bring them down. I don't care if you think that if all the nations get together and say, we're going to overthrow God. I believe that's Psalm 3. It says that God laughs in his throne. And then after he laughs at their face, thinking that they can overthrow him, he says, now I'm going to overthrow all of you. And I don't care if you have the strongest kings, the strongest military, they will be cut off and pass away. Verse 12. Look at verse 13. So now I will break this yoke bar from upon you, and I will tear off your shackles. The Lord has issued a command concerning you. Your name will no longer be perpetuated. I will cut off idol and image from the house of your gods. I will prepare your grave, for you are contemptible. Now, what has Nahum just said from verses 1 to 14?
Get ready to die.
Basically, he's
Hold them in derision.
exactly. He holds them in derision, prepared to die. What Nahum is doing, being inspired by God, using the words that God wants him to use, verses 1 to 14, he says, any nation that acts like this, but specifically Nineveh, your time is up. And if you are not careful, other nations, Babylon, which we're going to find out here in a little bit that he's going to be talking about, you will also be cut off and destroyed. But notice at the very end of the chapter, this is the next section. It's only one verse. After all this doom and destruction and describing a wrathful and vengeful God, look what he says. Behold, on the mountains, the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace. Celebrate your feasts, O Judah, pay your vows. For never again will the wicked one pass through you. He is cut off completely. Now, verse 15 is crucial to the entire book. Why? There's a key phrase in verse 15, and I'll give you a hint. It's also mentioned in Isaiah chapter 52, specifically verse 7. Okay, Nineveh is gone, verses 1 through 14, but then he transitions. You're absolutely right, but he transitions from the destruction of Nineveh to the victory of Judah.
Someone will come to announce peace.
That's exactly right. Somebody will come and announce peace. And look what he says, behold, on the mountains, the feet of him who brings good news. Do you remember Isaiah chapter 52 and verse 7? Is anybody there in Isaiah chapter 52 and verse 7?
Okay, I got it.
What does it say?
How beautiful upon the mountain are the feet of him who brings good news, who proclaims peace, who brings glad tidings of good things, who proclaims salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns.
Okay. How beautiful are the feet on the mountain who brings good news and declares peace and says, your God reigns. Isaiah is prophesying about the Messiah. In fact, the very next chapter, actually starting at the end of chapter 52, going into chapter 53, you read about the suffering servant, who is in fact Jesus the Christ. Well, Nahum mentions this message of good news and this mountain, and you talking about the feet of him who brings the good news. Imagine somebody from World War II running as fast and as hard as they can to get to their superior saying, we have won. The enemy has surrendered. We can go home. Imagine all of the soldiers that were able to go back home to see their families. Imagine that message. You see somebody running in the distance as fast as they can. And you know sometimes when somebody's coming towards you, if they've got good news or bad news, well, this person has a smile on their face. They're running as hard as they can. And it's almost like they can't get to their destination fast enough. And they're getting onto themselves saying, go faster. We need to spread this good news. We've won the war. Our king reigns. Well, he's talking to Judah of him who brings good news, who announces peace. Celebrate your feasts, O Judah. Pay your vows, for never again will the wicked one pass through you. He is cut off completely. Now, if you look at this in the literal sense, talking about Judah, he says that your enemies will never again pass through your land. Well, if you look, I believe 100 to 200 years later, you would see that Judah is actually taken into captivity by the Babylonians. So was Nahum wrong in saying that Judah, now Israel's already been taken at this point, the northern kingdom of Israel, they've already been captured. They're already in captivity within Assyrian power. But Judah is still reigning in the south. Okay? So if they're still reigning in the south, And Nahum says, now Judah, you can continue feasting. You've got victory, and no enemy will pass through your land once you receive this good news. But Babylon comes in. They wipe out Jerusalem, destroy the temple, take all of the righteous people into captivity. Ezekiel, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and all of those individuals who are faithful in the remnant of Judah. Was Nahum wrong? No. Then what is Nahum talking about?
Judah didn't learn a lesson from Israel. What had happened to Israel, they did worse.
So, building off of that, Judah didn't learn from their sister Israel. We actually read about that in the book of Micah. Okay? And because of that, they were taken into captivity. Well, you read in the books of Daniel, Ezekiel, Ezra, Nehemiah, that when they come out of captivity, they return back to Jerusalem, they follow the law, and they stay faithful to the law. The book of Zechariah and Haggai talk about this. We'll get to that, Lord willing, in the coming weeks. But through Judah, it specifically mentions Judah, through the line of Judah, who would bring the good news? Jesus the Christ. If you read the gospel simply means good news. Who brought the gospel? Jesus the Christ. The good news about Jesus, the gospel of Jesus the Christ. Nahum is saying, even though, and remember how we said it's interesting how he's only talking generically about nations, not specifying Nineveh. He's talking about nations as a whole. Nations are wicked. They're this way. But don't worry. Through Judah will come good news. What is the message of Nahum in chapter 1?
Vengeance will come to those who are evil, but there is good. Down the road, there's a good thing coming.
Exactly. Even though there may be nation after nation after nation that rises and falls with wickedness, there will be a nation, a kingdom that will rise full of peace and mercy and good news that will not fall in such a way like Nineveh, but they will reign for all of eternity. Well, if you look at what Nahum is saying, nation after nation, you've got the Assyrians, then the Assyrians fall, then you've got the Babylonians, then after the Babylonians fall, you've got the Medes and the Persians, and after the Medes and Persians fall, you've got the Greeks, they come in, and the Greeks, they reign for a while, and then Rome overtakes them, and then through Rome, they fall, and you've got the Celts, and then the Celts fall, and you got nation after nation after nation after nation. And each nation will rise and fall, rise and fall. But what's the one nation that has risen that has not yet fallen? The church. And while this kingdom is reigning, that is the church, it's doing this. And all of the individuals who are in these nations rising and falling, God is saying, your citizenship is not within these civilizations because they rise and fall. But if you put your civilization and your citizenship in my kingdom, you can have good news. Like Nineveh had at one point, but now they have turned back to their old ways. Now, look at chapter 2. After describing nations in general and describing who God is and the good news to come that would actually unite all of these kingdoms if they come to God, he now specifies the specific kingdom. He talks about Nineveh. And in your chart, I actually have listed on this side column here all of the descriptions of God, one after the other. After the description of God, he says, Judah, you're going to reign forever. You're going to have victory, talking about spiritual Judah. And then he talks about the judgment. He actually describes the judgment. In chapter 1, you have the judgment declared. In chapter 2, you have the judgment described. He gets a little bit more specific in the judgment. Verses 1 and 2, be prepared, God is coming. Be prepared, God is coming. The one who scatters has come up against you. Man the fortress Watch the road, strengthen your back, summon all your strength, for the Lord will restore the splendor of Jacob like the splendor of Israel, even though devastators have devastated them and destroyed their vine branches. Verses 3 through 7, you have, be it known, your people moan. Nahum says, you need to be prepared because God is coming. And when He comes, I just want everybody to know, every single one of you are going to be in utter agony because you have turned yourself against God. It says in verse 3, the shields of His mighty men are colored red. The warriors are dressed in scarlet. The chariots are enveloped in flashing steel. When he is prepared to march, and the cypress spears are brandished, the chariots race madly in the streets. They rush wildly in the squares. Their appearances is like torches. They dash to and fro like lightning flashes. He remembers his nobles. They stumble in their march. They hurry to her wall. And the mantelet is set up. The gates of the rivers are opened, and the place is dissolved. It is fixed. She is stripped. She is carried away, and her handmaids are moaning like the sound of doves beating their breasts. What Nahum is describing is Nineveh being overtaken by a nation that has chariots, that has spears, that is as fast as lightning, that remembers their nobles, that'll take their noble men and take them captive. Who does that sound like? Remember Daniel chapter 1? A nation came in, destroyed the city, but took those who were the nobles. Yes, ma'am.
I will say that Nineveh was so completely destroyed that they couldn't even find the ruins of it till 1845.
Yeah, they were completely devastated. As mentioned in chapter 1, verse 12, though they are full of strength and like many, even so they will be cut off and pass away. That's an understatement almost, if we were to take it as they will just be cut away. They will be completely cut away. They will be scraped clean from the land. I believe it was in the book of Exodus, it was mentioned a Sunday or two ago, how the Amalekites, their very memory will be forgotten because they went against God. Well, when somebody goes against God, you will not be known anymore. And what does God say to those who have transgressed His law on the day of judgment? Depart from me, for I never knew you. So great point. That they would be forgotten, that they would be completely destroyed. But who would be the one to do it as God's tool? It would be Babylon. Babylon was, I believe it was Nebuchadnezzar's father. Nebuchadnezzar II, that's the one that's mentioned in the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar I, which actually I think goes by a different name, he's the one, I believe, that overthrew the Assyrians, and then he passed away, and then his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, rose to power and then overtook Jerusalem. So you can see, if you look throughout history and what kind of people the Babylonians were. In fact, we'll see what kind of people the Babylonians were in the book of Habakkuk. Because Habakkuk's, in chapter 1, what's very interesting about Habakkuk, and this is a sneak peek, I won't get into too much because I don't want to give my whole class away for next week. But in the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk doesn't really prophesy to any nation. He is a prophet, and he does prophesy, but he's really just talking to God throughout the entire book. Chapter 1, going into chapter 2, he cries out to God and says, God, why are you allowing all of this wickedness to happen? Your people forget the law. Your people, Israel, or Judah, has completely turned their backs on you, and you're just letting it go unpunished. What kind of a God is that? And then God says, Habakkuk, don't worry. I'll take care of it. In fact, I'm going to bring in the Babylonians to destroy Jerusalem. And then Habakkuk's like, well, time out, reel it back in. Babylon's worse than us. That doesn't seem fair. Yes, we are wicked. I will admit that. But Babylon, they're way worse than us. You're going to use a nation worse than us to destroy us? Why don't you use a righteous nation to teach us a lesson? And are you not going to destroy them as well? It's almost like a child going to their parent and saying, Father, Mother, why are you letting my sibling just do whatever he wants? And he says, well, don't worry, you and him are also going to get punished by your older sibling. What? Wait a minute, you're going to give the belt to my older sibling? Yes. Is he not going to get punished too? He is in due time, but his time is not yet up yet. Okay, I'm still long suffering with him. He has a chance to repent, but ultimately he's not going to. That's the conversation between God and Habakkuk. Well, you'd see that description of Babylon in chapter 2 of how wicked they are. If you read Habakkuk chapter 2, you will see just what kind of nation is going to overthrow the Assyrians. They are terrible individuals. They're heathens. They're pagans. When you have a nation that knows not God, of course they're going to be wicked. Even God's chosen people rejected God. And because Judah and Israel did not know God, they also became wicked and terrible people. But the message of Nahum is God is full of love and mercy and grace, but He is also a vengeful and wrathful God. And He absolutely cannot let this go unpunished, because if He does let it go unpunished, He is no longer all loving and He is no longer all just.
That on that Anthony, you said, vengeance is mine, I will repay,
Yeah.
saith the Lord.
I think we also need to know God will do it in His time. Between Jonah and Nahum, long time's passed. Nineveh's been wicked for a long time. God will do it. He will do it in His time. And I'm sure if those that were being captured by the Assyrians, like the Northern Kingdom thought, well, why? When will God come? When will God make them pay? God will do it, but He'll do it when He wants to, when He deems it the right time.
And that is absolutely right. And what's I don't want to say humorous, but it's ironic, is throughout the prophets, every prophet says you need to repent or else God is going to have to remove His presence from you. And they said, we don't want Him. Get Him out. In the book of Ezekiel, God shows Ezekiel, I am removing my presence from the temple because of the wickedness that is in Jerusalem. Well, after God warns them for years, after generations, and He finally moves His presence and a nation comes in and destroys them, they're saying, where's God? He was there the entire time. And He warned you that He was going to leave. And He also said that He was going to punish you if you didn't turn. And now that it's happening, you're making it sound like it's God's fault. Why is God allowing all of these bad things to happen? Why me? Where is God? Well, God was there, but you pushed Him away. Do not put the blame on God. And if you look at our nation today, why is there so much suffering and wickedness in the world? There can't be a God. If God really was all loving and all just, He'd stop all of this. Well, at one point, we were one nation under God. We were a loving, godly people. But because we're pushing God away, when God is no longer in the picture, who comes in? The devil. The adversary. Somebody really bad. Somebody that wants to bring you down. And then you say, where's God? God isn't that. There is no God. If he was real, He'd be here with us. He was here with us at one point, but we pushed Him out. To say that there is no God because there's pain and suffering in the world is a cowardly cop-out for humanity. Because if we are trying to put the blame on God for our own actions, we definitely deserve what's coming. That's why we need to be like Habakkuk and say, you know what? Even at the very end of the book, even though this is going to happen, I'm going to live by faith because God is going to take care of His people. Even if we're destroyed in this life, we will be able to move on into the next. Now, We only have about 5 minutes left and one more chapter to get through, so we can do this. In chapter 3, after describing the fall of Nineveh, where's my marker? Let's see. You've got, I forgot this one. Good news. Let's do a review here. Good news. And then you've got the judgment described. And then here in chapter 3, you have Nineveh's complete ruin. It's almost like in the beginning, it's very general, and then he starts narrowing it down to the specifics until he gets to chapter 3. Chapter 1, all nations, if they act like this, are wicked, but there's going to be hope for those nations if they turn from their ways and run to the good news. Chapter 2, now let's talk about Nineveh. As a whole, here's what your destruction is going to be like. Chapter 3, now let's get down to the specifics. How is Nineveh going to be destroyed? Your king's going to fall, your people are going to be slaughtered, and your riches are going to be pillaged. So he starts general and then works his way down to the specifics in chapter 3. And in chapter 3, we don't have time to read all of it, so I'll just read this summary here. The judgment described, you can also describe it as the judgment deserved. Because in chapter 3, he actually says, this is why you're going to be punished. And remember how in each minor prophet, we've talked about how God doesn't just declare judgment and the people are like, well, what did we do wrong? And God's like, I'm not going to get to the specifics. You know what you did. God never does that. He gives specific reasons why they're going to receive judgment. And they can't say, well, no, we didn't do that. They know very well that they did those specific things. Now, let's look at this. Nahum concludes the oracle to Nineveh by telling them they will be utterly destroyed in 3 areas of their life. Their city, defense, and military, their greatness, and the number 3, and their people in numbers. He also gives the reason why they are receiving this judgment. They are a city of blood, full of lies and pillaging. Verse 1. There will come a nation, Babylon, who will plunder their town, destroy their city, and kill their people, and they will have no hope. That is Nineveh. Look at the very last verse of chapter 3. There is no relief for your breakdown. Your wound is incurable. All who hear about you will clap their hands over you, for on whom has not your evil passed continually? God says, you're not getting out of this, Nineveh. You're not. And your wound is incurable. That is, the judgment is not going to be moved and kept back from me anymore. I moved it from your forefathers because they repented, but you're not repenting. And so this judgment is coming. Your wound's incurable. And every nation is going to clap for your downfall because you have done wicked to every nation under the sun. You've got no friends. You've got no hope. And God is no longer with you. You will be utterly destroyed. And gloomily, if I can say that, that's how the book ends. But if you look right in the middle of the book, the good news, that's what everybody needs to be looking to when reading the book of Nahum. Nations, if they act like this, will fall. But if they turn from their ways and follow the good news, they will have peace. Any questions or comments? All right.